Hello everyone and welcome to today's session. Let's begin with a moment of focus. Namaste and a very warm welcome.
To dive into a seemingly simple fairy tale that, actually transforms pretty quickly into a brilliant, deeply dark satire penned by the legendary Oscar Wilde. It's called The Devoted Friend, and it was first published back in 1888. On the surface, it reads like your standard run-of-the-mill fable about friendship, but as we're going to see, Wilde is really using this story to hold up a very uncomfortable mirror to society.
Listen to this quote, because it's just a perfect encapsulation of our main antagonist's hypocritical mindset right from the jump. He says, "Flowers flower and friendship is friendship. Don't mix the two." This is coming from a wealthy miller who's explaining exactly why you won't give his struggling best friend any flour on credit. It perfectly sets up the core theme we'll be exploring today, that massive, sometimes literally deadly gap between the beautiful words we say about friendship and the actual actions we take.
All right, Part 1, The Devoted Friend Introduction.
So we begin our story with an honest, really kind-hearted guy named Little Hans and his exceedingly wealthy neighbor, Hugh the Miller. Now, these two are presented to us as the closest of companions. Hans lived in a tiny cottage, but he had the absolute most beautiful garden in the land, filled with sweet williams, carnations, rosemary, and daffodils, and Hans is just so proud to have a friend with such noble thoughts as the miller. But notice the dynamic here. The miller is always talking about how true friends share everything, yet it's always Hans doing the back-breaking work. The miller constantly swings by to pick Hans's flowers and herbs, but he never actually gives a single thing in return. This completely unequal dynamic becomes painfully obvious the second the seasons change. In the spring and summer, Hans prospers. But in the winter, without any flowers to sell, Hans suffers from the freezing cold and severe hunger. Meanwhile, the miller is staying toasty warm by his roaring fire, enjoying red wine and delicious food. And the miller's justification for this? Oh, he claims that visiting Hans in the winter would only make Hans jealous, and that leaving him alone builds character. He uses this completely twisted logic to justify completely abandoning his friend, while poor Hans just suffers in total isolation.
Moving right along to Part 2, The Broken Wheelbarrow Promise. As spring finally rolls back around, the snow melts, and Hans's flowers begin to bloom again. The miller decides it's time to visit. Hans mentions that he desperately needs to sell his flowers to buy back a wheelbarrow he had to pawn just to get winter bread. Hearing this, the miller makes this grand, sweeping declaration: "I believe selflessness is the essence of true friendship," and he promises Hans his old wheelbarrow. But of course, there's a catch. It is missing a side and has a broken wheel. The miller frames giving away this literal piece of garbage as an act of profound, unmatched generosity.
Now here is the absolutely crucial point. The miller never actually gives Hans the wheelbarrow. Let me repeat that. He never actually hands it over. Instead, he uses the mere promise of it as a bargaining chip. He essentially weaponizes the idea of this broken wheelbarrow to guilt-trip Hans, extracting endless labor and free goods from his incredibly trusting friend.
Let's look at Part 3, The Price of Friendship. There is a vast, honestly darkly comedic gulf between the miller's lofty theories on friendship and his incredibly selfish, real-world practices. On one hand, he loves to preach from his soapbox about the selflessness of true friendship. On the other hand, well, look at his actions. He immediately demands a plank of wood Hans had been carefully saving. Then, he straight up demands a massive basket of Hans's flowers, leaving Hans with literally nothing to sell at the market. And the demands, they just keep escalating. First, the flowers. Next, the miller makes Hans carry a heavy bag of flour miles and miles to the market. When Hans is completely exhausted the next day, the miller has the nerve to call him lazy and forces him to spend the entire day fixing the miller's own roof. After that, he orders Hans to herd his sheep up a mountain. And every single time Hans hesitates because, he needs to tend to his own dying garden, the miller simply brings up the broken wheelbarrow. The guilt trip works flawlessly every single time. And if you want to understand how a guy like the miller actually sleeps at night, just listen to his twisted logic. He actually says, "Many people behave well, but few people speak well." This just shows that words are much harder than actions. It's a brilliant piece of satire by Wilde. He's showing us how hypocrites use eloquence to mask their own cruelty. In the miller's twisted mind, just talking beautifully about friendship is considered much harder, and therefore way more valuable than actually being a friend.
Which brings us to Part 4, A Tragic Stormy Night.
The story reaches its harrowing climax one evening when the miller bangs on Hans' door in an absolute panic. His son has suffered a terrible accident. The miller tells Hans that he urgently needs a doctor, but the storm outside is violent, it's terrifying. Instead of going himself, the miller demands that Hans go. And how does he secure Hans's compliance? Yep, you guessed it. He reminds Hans that he is going to give him the wheelbarrow, so it's only fair that Hans does this incredibly dangerous favor in return. Hans, ever the devoted friend, immediately agrees out of pure loyalty.
But Hans is facing a terrifying obstacle out there. It is pitch black, and the rain is just coming down in buckets. Hans begs to borrow the miller's lantern so he doesn't fall into a ditch on the way. The miller's response? He flat out refuses. He says his lantern is brand new and he doesn't want it to get damaged in the storm. The miller literally values a piece of glass and metal over his best friend's safety. It's a horrifying realization of how little Hans actually means to him.
Incredibly, Hans manages to reach the doctor and sends him back on horseback. But Hans himself, he has to walk back on foot. Without the lantern, unable to see in the dark and the raging storm, he wanders off the path into a dangerous bog. He falls into a deep hole and tragically drowns. Because he was denied a simple lantern, poor little Hans pays the absolute ultimate price for his unwavering devotion.
Now for part 5, the chief mourner. Hans's body is found the next day by a goatherd. Now you might expect the miller to be completely racked with guilt, right? To finally learn his lesson after causing this terrible tragedy. Instead, even in death, he uses Hans. At the funeral, he proudly declares, "I was his best friend, so it's only fair that I have the best place," making absolutely sure he walks at the very front of the procession. He makes this grand, dramatic show of wiping his tears with a handkerchief, purely to look good and seem like the most grief-stricken person in front of all the neighbors.
And you know what the absolute kicker is? After the funeral, when the townspeople are talking about what a great loss little Hans is, the miller chimes in to complain. He complains that he was just about to give Hans his broken wheelbarrow, and now he is stuck with it cluttering up his home. Hugh the miller undergoes absolutely no Scrooge-like epiphany here. There is no sudden change of heart. His only regret is the mild inconvenience of still having his own broken junk.
Finally, part 6, the true moral revealed.
Now that we've experienced the sheer, infuriating injustice of this story, we can finally pull back the curtain on Wilde's true intent. Wilde actually presents this tale through what's called a frame story. It's being told by a bird, a linnet, to a self-absorbed water rat who acts very much like the miller. This whole story is a brilliant piece of satire. Wilde is poking fun at the highly serious, moral-heavy fairy tales of his contemporary, Hans Christian Andersen. I mean, notice he even named the doomed character Hans. Wilde is satirizing the kind of moral fables where a grand message is proudly stated, but never, ever actually acted upon in reality.
The literary depth of the piece relies heavily on 2 central symbols. First, the garden. The garden represents Hans's true essence, his honest work, his lifeblood. He is truly rich in spirit. But the miller systematically destroys that garden, pulling Hans away from it using the empty symbol of a broken wheelbarrow. And that wheelbarrow is exactly what the miller's friendship is. It's broken, it's useless, and ultimately, it's something that drags Hans down into the mud.
The core takeaway here, the big message at the end of the story, is that actions speak louder than words. The devoted friend exposes the deadly gap between claiming to be a friend and actually acting like one. The true tragedy of the story isn't just the terrible storm. It's that Hans was too innocent, too blindly trusting, to see that Hugh's everyday practice fell completely short of his beautiful theory.
Wilde leaves us with no neat, tidy, happy ending where the bad guy learns his lesson. Instead, he leaves us with a mirror. If a story punishes the innocent and rewards the hypocrite, what is it truly teaching us about the nature of our own friendships? Are we the miller, offering up broken wheelbarrows to the people in our lives? Or are we Hans, sacrificing our own beautiful gardens for people who don't truly value us? I'm going to leave you to reflect on that incredibly dark but totally vital question, straight from the genius mind of Oscar Wilde.
Thank you so much for watching this video. Make sure to subscribe to the channel for more updates.